A warm welcome to Executive Talks, a virtual space where executives talk and executives listen. We have come to meet you in another episode with an interesting topic: youth development in developing countries. For this discussion, we have invited to a lady. She is the founder and the president of Hive Sri Lanka, which is the first youth empowerment incubator in Sri Lanka. She is also the founding president of Young Legal Professionals Association of Sri Lanka. She has done many projects with United Nations, with Sri Lankan government, and with various other institutes. By profession, she is a lawyer. In short, she is a youth empowerment advocate specialized in youth empowerment incubation. She is Chiranthi Senanayake. Hi Chiranthi, a warm welcome to Executive Talks.
Hi, Dhananjay. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
I hope you are keeping yourself safe despite the COVID situation.
Yes, definitely. The situation is a lot better here. I mean, it is getting better here in London, but the country is under pseudo lockdown. So I am stuck in my room and I am sort of engaged in my studies these days.
Great. Hope things will be better in coming days. Moving on to our discussion, Chiranti, there is no doubt that youth is the segment a country should focus on developing its economy. As an expert in youth empowerment, how do you explain the importance of youth empowerment?
Thank you so much for the question, Dhananjay. So, why the question is interesting is because, I mean, mainly my experience with regards to youth development and youth empowerment comes from the past 10 years where I've worked in both the state and non-state sector in terms of youth empowerment and youth development. And why I believe that youth empowerment is crucial and absolutely important is because of three main factors. And the first factor is because of the sheer number or the sheer size of the youth population in the world as well as in Sri Lanka. So, if you take a look at the statistics, especially the statistics that have been put forward by the United Nations according to the United Nations definition of the youth population. So, the UN defines the youth as those between 15 years and 24 years. So, according to them, the present youth population is actually 1.2 billion people, and it's projected to increase to 1.4 billion people and peak at 1.4 billion people in 2065. So we actually currently have the largest youth population that has been recorded in human history, and that really shows us the magnitude and the diversity of the youth population that we're dealing with. And even in Sri Lanka, we have actually more than 4 lakhs or 4.1 lakhs of young people between the ages of 15 and 29 years. Because why there is a definitional change is because Sri Lanka has its own unique definition of which population cohort constitutes youth, and that's those between 15 years and 29 years. So I think one reason why a country has to focus on youth empowerment is simply because a significant number of the in-house population is actually composed of young people. And the second reason, the second reason is actually because young people play a very unique role in terms of social progression and human evolution. Why I say that is because young people are actually actors of the present that are to sort of inherit a world of tomorrow. So they have to play a key role in the present, in status quo, to ensure that they shape the world that they're going to inherit in the future. So that is why it is essential not to think of young leaders as the leaders of tomorrow, but to think of them as actors of the present and shapers of the future. So they, in my opinion, and this is something that I have experienced firsthand as well, seeing the young people I have worked with develop, and come into positions of leadership in the past 10 years, what I sincerely believe is that the youth are sort of the connecting factor between the present and the future. And that's why it is essential for a country to sort of focus on youth development. And the third reason, in my opinion, is because youth are a very unique population. What I mean by that is that they're very energetic, they're persevering. Often changes in human history have occurred because of rebellious young people who've not been comfortable with how the system has run. But at the same time, they're also very emotional, and they're very susceptible to influence, to impression. That's why we see politicization of young people. That is why we see radicalization of young people. So they actually have certain qualities that can be harnessed towards good, that is towards sustainable national development or sustainable global development, or it could also be misused and sort of harnessed towards the wrong means or the wrong ends. So those are the three reasons why I believe a country has to focus on youth empowerment. It, purely from an economic perspective, the youth population actually forms a considerable percentage of a country's labor force. So in order for a country's labor force to actually not merely be manpower or man hours, and for them to sort of contribute back as human capital, it is essential for the country to sort of invest in creating young people that are able to respond to the modern day job market and the modern day requirements of a knowledge based transactional economy. So that's the reason why I feel that a country definitely has to prioritize and focus on youth empowerment.
Thank you, Chiranthi. I think with the numbers and when you look at the age ranges, that is the age where you start certain things, you start your career. So that area will be very important when we drive youth empowerment. With that, Chiranthi, another question came into my mind. Do developing countries pay enough attention to this, like especially developing countries like Sri Lanka?
Yes. So with regards to that question, I would say that, especially if you take a look at the importance of sustainable national development that came out in a post World War II context, as in as soon as World War II was over, the attention of the world actually focused on two things. One is human rights and promoting universal human rights, and the second thing is this ideology that where no one is left behind. So actually, if you take a look at the Sustainable Development Goal framework that we're following now, that's also a byproduct of that thinking which came in a post-World War II context. And because youth empowerment and getting young people involved in national development, in global development is such a trending topic, I have noticed that especially in the past few decades, presidents who have sort of come up, or it could even be entire governments who have been voted in, have constantly used this tagline of youth empowerment as like a perhaps I would say a flag or sort of a label to garner votes and to say that we are actually a government that is pro youth and youth friendly. But at the same time, most of these promises of youth empowerment have been restricted to election times, have been restricted to a simple manifesto. And once more the governments in developing countries, I mean, this is a common experience in most developing countries, once they have been voted in, this discussion hasn't really transpired into something productive. And I will actually explain this using my experience of is working with the Sri Lankan government in terms of youth development. So I do believe that the governments in developing countries actually recognize the importance of young people, but the problem is it hasn't materialized into what I call sustainable and inclusive youth development. And why I say that is because of a few key factors. The first thing is, I feel that especially in developing countries, there is a very outdated understanding of what the needs of young people are. I mean, if you take a look at the rhetoric that is there in our political landscape, may it be the parliament, may it actually be even local level discussions about youth empowerment, the main factors that we speak about is that young people want jobs, young people want education. And the government in most developing countries actually revolves the youth development discussion around education and employment. But so what I'm trying to say is that the modern needs of the youth are actually neglected when it comes to this government and administrative level dialogue. I mean, you yourself stated that the age bracket of 15 to 29 years is the age bracket in a person's life where they try to figure themselves out, where they try to sort of explore and identify what their purpose in life is. So especially young people of modern day are needing much more than merely employment and education. They are needing the opportunity to actually start their own ventures, to start their own businesses. They are needing the opportunity to, let's say, have digital literacy and have greater access to the internet. They are needing an opportunity to lead a private and satisfactory, family life. So the needs of young people in the modern day are far more complex than what it was when we started discussing youth empowerment and youth development maybe 50, 60 years ago. So that is one problem I see, where developing countries are not essentially taking into account the modern day needs of the youth. And then the second perhaps shortcoming that I identify is the fact that in most developing countries there is a lack of a national youth policy, a central national youth policy, which states what really a country's aim in terms of youth empowerment is. So, if you take a look at the Sri Lankan example, the national youth policy that is currently in place was the one that was formulated in 2014, which means that for the past 6 years, the Sri Lankan youth policy has not been actually amended, nor has it been revised, nor has a new, more modern youth policy come out. So that it is essential that there is a centralized national youth policy which sets out a particular incumbent government's aims in terms of youth development. And if you take a look at parliamentary debate as well, I mean, even in the previous government or even the current government, youth development actually comes up very, very rarely. You do have discussion on education, employment. It's a common tagline where, politicians, not only in Sri Lanka, but in developing countries, where they say that we need to employ young people, we need to educate young people, but the discussion simply halts there. So that's the second thing I've noticed, that most developing countries don't have a centralized, updated national youth policy. Then thirdly, I want to comment on a problem that is again inherent to developing countries, but I also notice this in developed countries as well, which is the fact that there is a considerable politicization of the youth, and politicization of government systems that try to empower young people. Again, to sort of explain it, I will sort of share a couple of my experiences of working with the government sector. Now, I don't mean to sound negative, and I know the Sri Lankan government actually runs a national youth development framework through the National Youth Services Council. The National Youth Services Council has local level youth clubs, and it is one of the strongest youth club systems in the world. I mean, it is actually recognized as one of the most far-reaching and strongest youth club systems. But what I've actually noticed is the Sri Lankan governmental structures of empowering young people are heavily politicized. I mean, I have actually worked directly with the National Youth Services Council after my appointment as United Nations Youth Delegate, and I'm truly grateful for that opportunity. And it was an amazing experience to work with the National Youth Services Council. But in my experience, when you walk into the National Youth Services Council, the first thing that you will notice is that there is actually an office that is dedicated to the party that is in power. So then comes the question, if the National Youth Services Council is supposed to be a body for young people, should essentially there be a separate recognition of the party that is in power? So that essentially shows that in terms of the governmental structures which oversees youth empowerment, politicization is a big obstacle. And what happens is that, especially through the national systems in these developing countries, the incumbent political party that is in power uses these frameworks to actually reach out to young voters, sometimes even to use these young voters as supporters of their campaigns or the party's manifesto. And it is more or less a situation where young people are sort of, utilized as a tool by which their, political agendas can actually be realized. I'm sorry, I'm being very frank about this, but this is actually an experience of developing countries which has to be highlighted. So that's a third factor, politicization of the governmental systems, which leads to a politicization of the youth population. Then the fourth and final aspect in relation to this particular question that I want to share is that in developing countries especially, we have a high dependency on what we call the bottom to top approach for development. So bottom to top approach for development is this idea that you actually get community level leaders and community level actors, grassroots level actors, to be involved in the overall development of any program towards community empowerment. So, of course, the bottom to top level is very important. But the problem is, if you take a look at youth development and how it operates in most developing countries, the stakeholders are always encouraged to interact with the community, to focus their attention on the community. So, when you actively encourage the stakeholders to be community leaders only, they actually neglect their attention from taking part in top level youth empowerment activities. What we mean by top level youth empowerment activities are like apex level decision making that is very important for youth development, like youth policy formulation, youth infrastructure development. So, for example, governments in developing countries would rarely sit at the same table with youth organizations, other actors in the youth developmental system when, let's say, formulating a policy or when actually talking about youth development at a high level. And it is aggravated by the fact that the percentage of young parliamentarians in developing countries are very less. So you anyway don't have parliamentarians who are able to sort of express the experience of young people. So that's a problem with the dependency on the bottom to top approach, when you get the stakeholders only to work in a community level and hope for the work that they do in the grassroots to trickle upwards to decision makers and leaders. In developing countries where there is a lot of bureaucracy, there is red tape, where the governmental systems aren't efficient, that impact isn't there. So those are actually, I think, 4 shortcomings that if we are able to overcome, we definitely can with greater youth participation in top level processes and greater stakeholder interactions. That is something we can actually, if we can overcome it, we can actually create inclusive and sustainable youth development.
Okay. Chiranthi, now I have a follow-up question on the first fact that you shared. Now, this youth empowerment, and youth is a hot topic in election campaigns. But not after that. Even during the election time, as you said, they are focusing only about employment. What are your suggestions to overcome that issue?
As in the issue of outdated discussions, is it?
Correct.
Yes. So I think that actually the best way to overcome it is to actually increase youth participation and interaction with young people. What I mean by that is that whenever the government is formulating an education policy, and it can even be an employment policy that is targeting young people, it is the ability to actually have consultations with young people from different backgrounds and from different experiences to identify what young people really need now. Because for example, whenever I conduct, youth developmental sessions outside of Colombo, and whenever I ask this question, what do you as young people need? Are you in need of, let's say, governmental jobs, or are you in need of, secured employment in the private sector? There is a significant number of people who actually say we would love to have greater access to loans or, subsidized venture capital so that we can start our own businesses. So that is what I meant by saying that young people's needs are far more different from what our parents actually wanted when they were our age. So the best thing I can recommend is to actually have one-on-one consultations, to have interactions, and to not rush policies, because that's something that we have seen happen in developing countries, where to meet targets, policies are always created in a rushed way and the policy cycle is expedited. So when you actually increase the speed of the policy cycle, that means you have to cut down on the number of consultations you have, the number of focus group discussions you have. So I think and the second thing is, I feel that when you think of policy, we need to think of policy in the long term in developing countries, because see, when different parties get voted in, they tend to change the policies that they put forward, and there is a lack of what we call policy consistency in developing countries. So if we are able to have consultations with young people, if we are able to have not speeding up the public policy just to tick boxes and to meet what they have, actually the list that they have in their mind in terms of what they need to deliver. And thirdly, if we can actually ensure that there is policy consistency, where we, let's say, make a youth policy for the next 10 years. And if the current government doesn't get voted in the next election cycle, if there is sort of support from the secondly elected political party to adhere to the same youth policy, I think aspects like that are the best recommendations I can give in terms of ensuring that the youth empowerment discussion is very timely and that it's appropriate.
Moving forward, Chiranthi, now you are into youth empowerment incubation. Now, what is the importance of it as an ideology?
Thank you so much for that question. That question is very invaluable because youth empowerment incubation is an idea that we are trying to mainstream, and it has been an immense challenge to actually do that, simply because the idea is very new and the current youth empowerment field is not used to is actually not used to this ideology of youth empowerment incubation. So youth empowerment incubation, I will first explain it as a theory, and then I will sort of relate it to practical scenarios so that it is better understood by the listeners. So youth empowerment incubation is an ideology where we try to streamline the youth developmental system by encouraging parallel focus on what we call top level youth empowerment and grassroots level activism. So it is a ideology that recognizes that in order for there to be effective youth empowerment, we need young people working in the community level to empower other youth. We also need young people engaging in top level processes like youth policy formulation, youth infrastructure development, to ensure that there is inclusive and sustainable youth development. And the youth empowerment ideology seeks to achieve this streamlining through two main avenues. So the first avenue is greater participation of young people in top level youth empowerment processes. Second avenue is where we encourage stakeholders in the youth developmental system. We're talking about the large number of youth organizations operating in developing countries. We're talking about the non-governmental organizations, the civil society organizations, even the governmental organizations, to actually interact and collaborate with one another. So that's what the ideology is about. So the ideology is focused mainly on fixing the system rather than purely working with the community. I mean, community activism is encouraged and that is very important, but our focus mainly is on fixing the system, because the issue we've noticed is no matter how much you try to work with the community and no matter how much you try to empower the community, if you're doing it through an unsustainable system, there is no way that your outcome is going to be sustainable. So what we're trying to do is to promote sustainable youth development through a sustainable youth developmental system.
Exactly. I think it's a brilliant approach to empower youth. With that, Chiranthi, now during the introduction, I said I found out that you are the founding president of Hype Sri Lanka. So, what is the story behind Hype?
That's actually interesting. So, I actually started my youth empowerment experience. So, from my first volunteering, experience. So that was back in 2009, and I was part of this group of young women, and we got the opportunity to go to a rehabilitation center in Mudatif, and the rehabilitation center was mainly for former female child soldiers and LTT child soldiers. Sorry. We've actually asked to spend a day with them and to interact with them and to really learn from them. And that experience where young people, young women who were my age, whose experiences were very different from mine simply because they were born to a different background or they were born to a different, community at a particular time in Sri Lankan history. So what I saw is that simply because those factors were different, their destinies were very starkly different to what I experienced as a young girl. So that's when I realized that there is so much of diversity and not diversity rather, but disparities in terms of what young people experience within their life, and that's where my passion for youth development actually started. So from 2009 up until we started Hype Sri Lanka back in 2019, for the past 10 years, I have worked with youth organizations as well as governmental systems and international systems. And when I worked with all of them, what we actually recognized was the fact that all those problems that I discussed before, and also the fact that these stakeholders within the youth developmental system, they sort of work in isolation. Now, if you take a look at the youth organizations that are in Sri Lanka, we actually don't have a record of the number of youth organizations that are in Sri Lanka. So, and that is also a problem simply because when we started Hype Sri Lanka, I remember we did a survey to find out how many of the responding youth organizations were registered. And the alarming fact was close to 65% of them admitted that they weren't registered with the government. So one problem we have is the fact that we don't even know the number of youth organizations that are operating in Sri Lanka. But in addition to that, we've also noticed that the actors of the youth developmental system, they want to actually, work in isolation. They want to be the best youth organization, or they want to carry out the largest project. So there is this inherent competition which prevents them from actually partnering whenever they organize something. So that was one key problem that we noticed. Then the second key problem we noticed is the fact that most of the actors in the youth developmental system, they were actually looking for platforms and opportunities to improve their organizations. Because in the youth developmental system, especially youth organizations, they lack a lot of organizational sustainability. So what I mean by that is, let's say there is a group of friends and they want to actually do a project for it can be any sort of project. It could be about the environment. It could be about, let's say, giving books to, a school where there are children from underprivileged backgrounds. And usually when young people have an idea, they're very committed to it. So what usually happens is that group of friends would get together and they would form a Facebook page. They would they would form a Facebook page, but they would, before that, actually create this pseudo-organizational structure, and they'll try to give a name to that organization. And once they have a name, then they create the Facebook page. And that more or less in the idea is having a youth organization. And once the project is conducted, I've seen this happen in the past 10 years so many times. When you are volunteering, life gets in the way. I mean, it could be your studies, it could be the fact that, you're entering into a family life, because when we talk about young people, it's people between 15 and 29 years. So we're talking about people who are in their secondary education, and we're also talking about people who are actually married with, let's say, a child, right? So when life gets in the way, those young people actually find it hard to continue volunteering. And then the organization just either exists without functioning or simply dies. So there is that problem with organizational sustainability, and they're constantly looking for avenues to improve themselves. So when I actually was observing all of this, I realized that where the youth developmental system, not just in Sri Lanka, but globally where it's going wrong, is the fact that there is no entity or no process by which you try to facilitate youth empowerment in the form of people who try to carry it out. As in, we don't have a supportive mechanism for actors in the youth developmental field. So that's why we want to introduce this concept of youth empowerment incubation, because we are actually not incubating young people, we are incubating the actors of the youth developmental system, we are supporting the actors of the youth developmental system so that they are better able to carry out their work. So when I was thinking about this, I actually when I rather observed this lacuna or this loophole or this shortcoming in the system, I spoke to one of my very good friends, that's Kasunjit Satanarachi. So Kasunjit is someone, he's actually a person with a disability, and he's someone that I met through MUN. And I remember we actually met at Dutch Burger Union in Colombo, and we just sat down and we were talking about this. And I was telling him how we need an incubation element in the youth developmental system. Then both of us sat down and we mapped out the organization. And then we actually started, contacting people or young people who have been in the youth developmental sector as long as we have. and then we were able to actually put together a director board. And what we actually realized was, in order for our organization to be sustainable, we need to not do the same mistakes that other youth organizations have done. So that's why I remember in the first 6 months, we sat down and we created a constitution for the organization. Why it took so long is because there is no model constitution for youth organizations that is accessible to the public. I mean, if you take a look at any of the other youth organizations, their constitutions, let's say, are not publicly available or they're not accessible. So you don't have a model that you can work on. So we sat down and for 6 months from scratch, we built a constitution. And now we're very happy to say that that constitution is available on our website. So any youth organization can go to our website, look at our constitution and make their own. So that's one step we took to ensure that we don't really, go down the same path of rushing things in the organizational process. So that's how Hype started. So we actually started as an organization or a group back in March 2019, but we only launched our organization in January this year because we wanted to take that gap and to ensure that our processes and the organizational cores are solid. So that's how Hype started actually. And right now we have grown in the past year or so. We've come quite a humble journey. So, for example, we have 64 youth organizations that are registered with us. We have a director board of 11 people and we have a volunteer base of 30. And we work quite hard to sort of realize our vision to mainstream youth empowerment incubation.
I feel like it's a proactive approach where we address the cause of the problem rather than taking reactive actions. Now, moving forward, Chiranthi, if I may ask, what is the scope of Hype? If you can briefly tell me few projects that you are handling right now.
Yes, so since I've already spoken extensively and for a long time about Youth Empowerment Incubation, I won't dwell into that ideology again, but that's our main ideology. That is essentially the core principle that we try to follow in our projects. So we actually, one practice that we do is we have a director board that is actually a perpetual director board until they actually come to the age of 30, which is the according to our constitution, that is the age by which we go beyond being young. Why I stressed on that is because one problem that youth organizations face is, especially if you take a look at large scale movements like Rotaract, Leo, Isaac, is that the leadership changes every year. So when the leadership changes, the nature of the projects change, their priorities change. But in Hype Sri Lanka as a practice, we actually have director board appointments in perpetua. Unless and otherwise they are asked to leave or they leave voluntarily, we ensure that the leadership is as stable as possible. So under the leadership of the director board, we have what we call recurring projects. So we actually ensure we have projects that are relatively long term and that recur in our operational year. So we have 4 main projects that I would actually like to very briefly highlight to sort of show why the scope of Hype Sri Lanka as an incubator is very different from another youth organization that operates, because that's an allegation that we always get with youth organizations. There are so many youth organizations, why do you need another one? So I often try and share the projects to explain to them why our approach is different. So one project that we have is actually what we call the Hype Policy Tank. So the Hype Policy Tank is an independent think tank, and as far as I know, this is the only independent think tank that's dedicated towards facilitating the youth policy cycle. So our main focus is youth policy. Our main focus is top level youth discussion, and how we actually increase youth participation in the youth policy cycle is by sharing surveys, by outputting reports, by holding consultations and focus group discussions. So to give a few examples of our areas of focus, we actually conducted a nationwide survey called the Youth Public Policy Survey, by which under 6 thematic areas like self-identity, education and employment, we actually got the pulse of young people. We recorded the pulse of young people, and we actually used that data to create a model working policy for a youth policy for Sri Lanka. So that was purely a model working policy that we made. This was under no affiliation to the government. So I don't want to give the wrong impression, that's why. And this working policy we actually launched with at our official organizational launch back in January, on the 25th of January. So that was done by the High Policy Tank. And then we also conducted a survey on the causes of ragging and practices of ragging in tertiary education systems in Sri Lanka. We also had another survey which was very interesting, that was targeted mainly towards teachers in schools to try and identify what really are the barriers they face. In academic terms, that's called pedagogical challenges. What really are the barriers that teachers and educators face whenever they are actually studying or teaching within a particular system? So that's a type of sort of conversation that goes on in the High Policy Tank, and our main focus is to try and get young people to be interested in youth policy and to be involved in youth policy. Then the second project is what is also a rather unique project called Project Nexus. So that is actually an approach we have where we try and register all the youth organizations operating in Sri Lanka. So we're in the process of creating a database of all the youth organizations. And once we register youth organization, what we do is we cluster them based on the work that they do. For example, if there is a youth organization that's working heavily on promoting human rights, they fall within the human rights cluster. There are 24 clusters like that. And once they are clustered, our aim is to actually have what we call inter-cluster networking and intra-cluster networking. So inter-cluster networking is actually where we get the clusters themselves to network with one another. We get the governance cluster to meet the human rights cluster. We get the human rights cluster to meet the environmental cluster. Intra-cluster networking is where within that particular cluster, the organizations network. Like the environmental cluster networks within the environmental cluster. So why those two approaches are important is because we want to try and encourage and provide platforms for youth organizations across the country to meet one another. So that okay, for example, if I'm organizing a project in, let's say, Wilpattu, is there a youth organization that works in another youth organization that works in Wilpattu that can partner with us? So we want to try and get youth organizations to partner with one another so we don't repeat the same projects, and so our resources aren't very divided amongst the same type of project that we carry out in isolation. So that's the second a recurring project. Then the third recurring project is what we call the Hype Academy for Human Capital Development. So from that, what we're trying to do is to give standardized trainings through modules. So we create courses and modules that are important for youth organizations. So two courses that I want to sort of share. The first one is the module on disability sensitization. But that is actually a module we're making with a group of persons with disabilities, advocates for persons with disabilities who are disabled themselves, and they are actually making a module on how you can make your volunteer force or your human resource of organization sensitive to persons with disabilities. And the second module is actually about organizational sustainability. If you are running an organization, how do you ensure that it has people sustainability, program sustainability, and process sustainability? And so those are three main projects. And we also have a department, that's Kasunjit's department. That's the Department for Disabled and Vulnerable Communities Representation. Kasunjit's department also carries out several projects that are purely focused on promoting inclusivity in our program. So he makes sure that whatever projects we carry out are inclusive and sensitive to persons with disabilities. So that is actually like a sort of an overview of the main projects that we conduct. So as you can see, our projects are not mainly geared towards empowering the communities or mobilizing the communities. It's more system and big picture focused.
It is interesting to see the way Hype Sri Lanka has created its constitution, where it makes sure the people who are leading stay at these positions for some time. Having said that, Chiranthi, I have a follow-up question on the fact that you shared. You might be getting a lot of insights and trends about youth developments through these projects. Do you have any mechanism to influence policyholders regarding these trends and insights?
So the mechanism is mainly that what we are trying to do is to sort of first try and set up connections with the government. I mean, we have been desperately trying to sort of meet the government and especially meet the officials of the Ministry of Youth and Sports Affairs, and to sort of share our ideology and share our approach with them. But I mean, sadly, I actually will share a very unfortunate experience. So I remember when we were launching the organization back in January, the 25th of January, we actually sent invitations. We called the ministry, we called the National Youth Services Council, we called the National Youth Corps, every key actor from the governmental side in the youth developmental system. We tried and we called them and we invited them. And most of the time, it was difficult to get through to the officials in the first place. But there was one instance where I remember this was actually, this was actually the former Ministry of Youth, as in the ministry that youth fell under when there was the interim cabinet. We actually gave the invitation and an official call back, and he was like, I mean, this is with all due respect to him, and I'm completely fine with his opinion. He was simply like, there is no, my superior said that I don't have to come for this event simply because this is not an event organized by the United Nations. So then that actually, like, I had to prevent myself from laughing on the phone, simply because our government has a very strict understanding of what sort of event constitutes as important and worthy enough to attend. So it has been a challenge, really, and this is me not sort of giving an excuse to say that we have been relatively unsuccessful in trying to get through to the government and to create partnerships with the government, but we still keep trying. I mean, right now, we are in a phase of writing a letter to the Minister of Youth Affairs to sort of inform him and request a meeting with him. Of course, once the COVID-19 situation is under control and the government is able to sort of move away from purely focusing on the pandemic, to have a meeting with him. To discuss how we can actually encourage youth organizations to register with the NGO Secretariat. Because one problem that youth organizations face, even we are facing currently, is that the all voluntary social service organizations register with the national the NGO Secretariat. But in order for us to register, we actually have to first carry out 2 projects, then get those 2 projects ratified by either the governor of our area or the municipal council, and then only can we apply to the NGO Secretariat to register as an organization. So that's very counterproductive, because you're getting these youth organizations to organize projects, to canvas for money, to canvas for resources, without actually having some sort of certificate or license. So we wanted to actually talk about this process and see if we can reform it. But unfortunately, we still haven't sent the letter, of course, in this particular case. But in all our previous attempts to contact the government, we have been successful, but unsuccessful. We are very much open to working with them, but we're still trying to sort of establish those networks and connections.
I have another follow-up question, Chiranthi. Now, apart from the barriers that you have from these government officials and other people, do you have any other barriers in moving forward with this social movement?
Yes. There are a few key barriers. So the first one is actually with regards to trying and convincing youth organizations why this ideology is important. Simply because, see, young people in Sri Lanka are very passionate about volunteering, but sometimes they often view volunteering as a means to an end. For example, they view volunteering as, let's say, a way to improve their social skills, or to meet new people, or to simply have something to put in their CV. Like, they don't really think of volunteering in terms of the amount of benefit that you can give back to society. It has been difficult sometimes to convince youth organizations to come and register with us and to sort of be part of the Project Nexus experience. Because, there are basic question. We've been asked that so many times as well. Why would we as a youth organization register with another youth organization? So that has been a big barrier for us, and that is something we're still trying to sort of overcome and to work step by step towards. But things are getting a lot better. We went from having no youth organizations to have a network of 64 youth organizations, which is an absolute blessing. So that is one barrier. And I think the second barrier is also, of course, in terms of finances. Still we are very young, and it's been little more than a year, but we are sort of trying to now move into a district based level and to sort of establish a central organizational HQ in Colombo, and then to have chapters in other districts. So, I mean, canvassing for finances has always been sort of like a challenge, but we're slowly getting to a level of financial sustainability simply because of certain grants and opportunities we were able to secure. So that is the second main challenge. Those are the two main challenges that I can sort of note, because in terms of how our internal team runs, I have not really faced challenges in terms of their dedication and commitment, and simply how far we've come is purely because of the team effort. I mean, the number of calls they take towards later in the night. I mean, sometimes they're up with me till around 3 or 4 in Sri Lanka time morning working. So it's purely because of their dedication. But those two are the two challenges we're trying to overcome in terms of non-governmental experiences.
Right. I think this is the final question I have for you today. Now, if someone wants to join you as a maybe resource person or as a beneficiary, maybe a community member, or as you said, an actor who want to make a change, how can that person join your social movement?
So there are different ways in which they can actually be part of Hype Sri Lanka. So one way is where if it's an individual, they are most welcome to join our team and to work in one of the 9 different departments that we have. And so our departments are very varied. I would like to sort of share that as well. I mean, we have a department separately for research and innovations. So that's where we're trying to sort of introduce technology to how youth organizations run, and we're in the process of developing a system on how to manage your volunteer force. That's a software system. So that's an example of one department. Then we have a separate department for youth advocacy and activism. So there is a very diverse scope. And so I invite anyone listening in, if they want to sort of help us and join our team and be part of the Hype experience, you're most welcome individually. And then if you're an entity or an organization, there are the avenues by which you can get involved in Hype is, if you are a youth organization, you can register with Project Nexus. If you are, let's say, a donor or a sponsor, then also you can register with Project Nexus, because under Project Nexus we have this sub project called GAP, that's Grabber Project. So that's where we're trying to sort of connect, under the principles of incubation, we're trying to connect resource holders with people in demand for those resources. So if you, for example, would like to donate, or if you would like to sort of sponsor a youth organization or a project that they're doing, then you can definitely register with us. So how the registration takes place is, we actually have a website called hypesl.org. So that is our key website, and under our website there is a separate tab for Project Nexus, and when you click on that, you can register as either a resource provider or a youth organization. And if you are an individual and if you want to contact us, you can again contact us by filling the contact form on our website, or you can actually drop us an email to our Outlook email. So is it all right if I actually share the email, Dhanajay, verbally, or?
Yeah, you can, and I will put that in the description too.
Fantastic. So our email is hype.sl@outlook.com. So drop us an email, or you can even drop us a direct message through our Facebook page. That's just Hype Sri Lanka. And you will actually see our logo, which is actually Hype, where the Y is a person actually holding their arms up. So it's a turquoise logo, so it's very difficult to miss that. But make sure to even drop us a Facebook direct message, and we're more than happy to partner with individuals and other organizations that really want to make a difference in terms of the youth empowerment.
Thank you, Chiranthi. I think we had a great conversation, a comprehensive conversation regarding the youth development in developing countries. I think if the policy makers can take these facts into consideration in developing policies, that will have a greater impact in economic development, because the youth is the most important element in economic development. So, Chiranthi, thank you very much, not only for joining with executive talks to share your thoughts, but also for taking a step to develop the youth in this country.
Thank you, Dhananjay. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute honor to be here. Thank you.
Having said that, looking forward to meet you with another episode of Executive Talks where executives talk and executives listen. Stay connected. Thank you very much.